Today is a simple step-by-step tutorial to sketch and paint a waterfall. We're going to be using ink and wash, that is a permanent pen, and some watercolors. Everything I'm using is listed down below, and I'm going to talk you through each step of the process as we go along as well. And with that, we can pretty much just start. The reference I'm using is both up in the corner and also listed in the description down below, where you can find it on my Pinterest account. So let's start with a really easy sketch. We have this waterfall sitting in the middle of our page, or in the middle of our photo, soon to be in the middle of our page. And the thing about the waterfall is it's white. It's all that sort of air bubbling through the water, making it come out as a big sort of white misty mass. So we need to not try and overdraw it. Now there are lines within it, but largely we want to treat this waterfall as negative space. So all I'm trying to do here is find some of those biggest shadows where we can see through to the rock and then get the outline. But look, I'm not drawing a solid block like you often might. For example, for a house, you would draw a solid line, or usually draw a solid line at least. What I'm doing instead is I'm drawing this broken line which suggests hopefully that mistiness. Then we can get a bit more certain as we climb up the cliff on one side, and on the other we've got a slightly different feel to the cliff, so we'll get this kind of wobbly gestural line, still more certain, just a little bit more textured. And there we are. So we now have this feel of something gliding down through our page. Underneath we have the water, again a little misty close to the waterfall, so we'll just leave some of that edge unstated at the moment. And then as we come to the side, we have these rocks which we can capture with simple geometric shapes, and then we have the kind of clearer front edge of the lake or the river coming closer to us. I'll just get that a little more certain as well. In the very foreground we'll pop in a couple of rock-like shapes, and all you're trying to do is just imagine simple 3D cubes, but varied cubes, so they're not strictly squares, they've got all sorts of different angles to them. You can always add in more later, but just do a couple now to give yourself a foreground coming forward. Now what I want to do is start to get a little bit of the textures into these rocks. What you can see is this fascinating sort of layered effect coming through the rocks. And someone, I'm sure, can comment down below and explain the sort of geology behind that. But what it does give us is an opportunity to create simple marks to show the texture. So I'm just going to capture the idea of these layers and the way that they sort of angle down in places as well through simple, again, just geometric horizontal lines. Up here we've got quite a few as well. What we don't want to do though is do too much too far away from our point of interest. Our point of interest is negative space, so we want to build a lot of contrast around that negative space. Over here we can't see the rocks as easily in this reference. The photo itself is quite sort of, I don't know if it's underexposed or overexposed, but there's a lot of darkness in here. So we can just imagine similar textures. Again, trying just not to overdo what we're suggesting here. And something I should have done over here, which I didn't really, was bring some of these textures all the way to the edge of our waterfall, because that will just help us provide that, well, the edge, as I just said, it will help us provide that sort of definitive point where the sudden water, the negative space, emerges. Now, we've got lots of little bits and bobs we could keep going with. What I think I will do is just a tiny bit of hatching. Simple, probably to start with, simple vertical hatching like so, in some of our darker areas, or areas we want to imply are a little darker. And hopefully this simple act of hatching is providing us an easy way of sketching in that contrast. Sometimes, just going to move my stuff to one side, sometimes we just need to take a little bit of care just to keep that hatching nice and consistent, nice and neat. As soon as your hatching becomes a bit scribbly, it can take away from a scene rather than add to it. It can just distract. So I'm going to just take a little bit of care, but still keep it sketchy, of course. And there we go. I think for now, we can then move on to step two. Step two, of course, will be where we start to introduce some colours. Now, we've got interesting decisions to make here. If you squint at the image, it's probably fair to say that the sky is the brightest thing in the image. So we don't want to overdo the sky. We're talking about the waterfall being negative space, but again, squinting at it, it's probably a little more grey, a little higher in value than the sky. So I'm going to start with water in the sky and then coming down the waterfall. I want to try and get this misty feel. So find, again, where this mist is coming across, there's like a little line of it coming like this across our page, across our photo. And maybe if I just angle the page like so, you can see where I've got the water in the reflection. And now we're going to use suggestive colours for that. A good one that we could use in my palette is lavender, or you could use any kind of blue, really well watered down. I'm going to use a bit of lavender, and if I put something slightly warm into that, like quinacridone sienna, burnt sienna, we get this soft grey, which will hopefully fit rather nicely with the mood of the scene. And there we go. Got this soft grey sky. We can change that, add a bit more lavender in places. And first just work a little bit of interest into this sky. So although it's a light grey sky, a hint of blue, still want a little bit of something in there, a little bit of some interest. Then make that mix a little deeper. Still trying to keep that neutral grey feel, using loads of water. And we can just start popping that in to the waterfall. And there's a little bit of a warm bit, here's a little bit of a cooler bit as we add more lavender. And just let that gentle tone seep down. Oh, I'm just going to soften that out a little bit. A little bit more water. And there we go. So that is really layer one done. We just gently added some tone into the negative space. I say that, I always say something like that, and then I decide, you know what, let's make it a little bit more interesting with some wet on wet effects. Wet on wet is where you add wet paint onto a wet page, and then you get this soft texture that gently emerges. And I'm just going to just use some gentle wet on wet splodges and blobs to make this a little more varied, including some sort of deeper touches and brighter oranges and things in there. We can also find, here's a pool of water emerging on my page. Now I quite like the idea of that water drying and leaving an interesting texture, but too much and it'll be too unpredictable, even for me. So I'm just going to pull out little areas of that. Little areas, and then I can go brave again, dot in a little bit more of our colour. And now what I'm going to do is just simply let that dry. When it's dried, we'll be able to come back and start painting around it and inside it to some extent to build up the value everywhere else and make this feel really light, bright and white and give it shape through negative space. And here we are back and pretty much dry. And now we're going to work around our waterfall. So I'm going to use similar colours in a sense. I'm going to use some quinacridone sienna and I'm going to use a blue. This time I'll use a combination of ultramarine blue and indigo. And this will enable me to get some nice deep dark tones. We'll also find some greens at some point and we'll add those into our scene as well. We can see some greens at the top here and we can find some other greens elsewhere in our minds or even in the image if we look really carefully. Now this mix of quinacridone sienna, burnt sienna or any other kind of lovely warm brown with a deep blue will give you a deep and dark pigment, and that is what we're going to start using here. That might be a little bit too dark for this layer, but a tiny bit more water and we're probably where I want it to be. And now we can use this big square brush, if you have one, to just find those deep shapes, those kind of geometric edges that we have been talking about. We can bring it down as well to this kind of misty edge. Just cut in a few places. I'm just cutting across with this wash. A few sort of painterly brush marks off to the side where we're less worried about being super accurate. and then come up the side as well. And here I'll start adding in a little bit more warmth, finding some slightly different tones, letting this wash become varied, become blended and sort of interestingly sort of melding together. Maybe even make it over this side where it's dark, a little more dark with a little bit more indigo. And again, just trying to cut in where we've got this kind of mist, just leave it a bit softer. Here it's actually still a little bit wet on the page, so that makes it nice and easy for us to be soft with the colours. And just building in, again, little gentle brush strokes. Same over here. Finding the gradual tone through the image. And all of this so far is just using 3 colours really, remember. Indigo, lavender and chromactone sienna. It's all we've used so far. Now I'm going to get a little bit of this misty texture in here with a bit of gentle brushing. So now I've really watered down that paint. And we'll keep plenty of this light coming through, but definitely sort of increase the tone beyond what it is, or increase the value rather beyond what it is. I'm going to leave some of this negative space up here, even though it's dark. I don't want too much going on up here, because I want us looking in the centre here. Over here again, maybe just drop in a little bit of water just to soften things out. And then we'll get the idea of this lake coming forward, leaving some horizontal whiteness in there so that we get the feeling that there's reflections and waves and things like that, which again, look at the reference and we can actually see them. So this is us both using clues from the reference and also ideas about what we think water should look like to build up our scene. Can just dib and dab in a couple of places, get that all the way to the edge, and we can move on to getting some of these dark areas as well. And we've got some really bold areas within, as well as just some gentle sort of lines. And this is where a big flat brush like this actually can be very delicate. We can use the edge, we can use it to create these lines we find in the water. And there we go. And then below here it becomes sort of very white, misty. We can do a tiny sort of dry brush in there to just create a bit more of that effect. And maybe at the top we want some deeper indigo in a couple of places. And because the brush is a bit dry now, you see that texture on the brush? Well, that transfers onto the page to create that kind of rocky feel. But before it's dry, I'm going to come in with my little round brush, size 6 round brush, and we can just pull out colour, we can soften areas, we can move that around. And at the top, we might even just want to create that top edge of the waterfall just to pull it apart from the sky as well. Same down here, we might just want to use our sort of more gentle, smaller brush to find little edges, pulling things apart from one another. Same all the way along here, we can just pull apart, we can be much more specific and careful and get the edge of our waterfall all the way down. Here it's a bit misty, so we left it a bit sort of purposefully vague. And here we've got sort of softening to do between these lines. So I'm just going to kind of come down with a slightly dry brush and feather to one side and another. This is really just experimentation. It's looking at what's happening, looking at your reference and deciding at what point you're trying to copy the reference, at what point you're trying to respond to what's happening here and sort of create your own sort of art rather than just representation of the photo. And I think, like so, I'm probably pretty happy with what's happening. Just going to pull out little bits of light, little bits here and there, make it a little softer, a little bit more like misty again. And then we're going to let this dry and we'll come back in with yet another wash where we'll really get the contrast down. And watercolour works in layers, and as we build up the layers, we build up the contrast and the depth of colour. So it's really important to let it dry so that you can achieve that build up. So we're back and we're now pretty much, in fact, almost completely dry. I'm going to use a slightly smaller flat brush now. And what we want with our smaller flat brush is our darkest colours. Again, I'm going to stick with my indigo and quinacridone. At some point, I'll probably, as I said before, I will be bringing in a little bit of ultramarine. But for now, we're just going to come in and be a bit more careful. Find these deepest dark areas that we want to find and pull them up, pull them apart, pull them in front. So we have this real contrast separating the waterfall out. And again, can't stress enough that watercolor works in layers. You can only achieve contrast through this gradual build up. If you try and rush the process, and even, I'm still doing it very quickly in just 2 or 3 layers really, but if you try and rush it, you will find it just becomes messy and you lose the transparency. So although this is deep in value now, the colour's still transparent. You can still see the lines through it and the ink underneath. That's what we want from our watercolours, or that's what most of us want from our watercolours. That lovely transparent feel, not losing the sort of watercolour magic whilst looking for the contrast. And hopefully you can feel from this, I'm certainly feeling in person that this waterfall, is emerging as the contrast builds up around it. We've got this misty area again, so I'm just going to introduce contrast at the edge of the waterfall. So we're definitely introducing the waterfall. I'm going to introduce contrast at the bottom, but leave this area light, and then introduce contrast again, high value, around this area with broad strokes, so we have that feeling of light coming through there. Underneath here, I think it's a little bit misty in the photo, but I think it's probably better served by having this area a bit darker than I had it already. And then we can come into the foreground. Well, this is sort of drying, it will settle down, we'll see what it looks like. I'm going to come into the foreground, and this is where we want real depth of colour, because here we're trying to get the boldest colours, the boldest tones, the darkest values, so that it comes in front of everything else. So just nice bold lines, still using this quite large flat brush, hopefully pulling that in front. And then let's start introducing a little bit of that ultramarine. What I want to do with that is just lift some of these deepest areas. So if I can get it in there, get it to shine within some of these shadows, in some of these bold areas, we'll hopefully see a little bit of light emerge, maybe a little bit in this water, for example, as well. Little touches here and there. We can use it just off to the edges as well. Maybe even, here's a little bit of an experimental idea. Let's pop it in these misty areas. Again, just as a, there you go, I think that works quite nicely to show that there's something going on there, but that it's not quite the same as elsewhere. Quickly going to move back again and start feathering in some of these bits of contrast to soften into our misty, dreamy areas. Same into the water here, just little bits of feathering, little bits of lifting of light, even little bits of splashes of water. And then really deep, dark colour, which we can also achieve through a nice small brush like this. Now, around some of our rocks, we can be more specific. Add that darkest layer of colour. Around these sort of silhouetted rocks, we can do the same. Got to be careful here because this colour is now going to be a little bit opaque. It is going to be a little bit non-transparent, which again, like I said, normally we're looking for nice and transparent watercolours, or most of us are. So just be careful when you really start getting it very thick that doesn't get lost too much. There we go. Now in here we've got some darker things to pick out again, so let's just closely observe and find those darkest areas, and they're all quite linear with some sort of splodges in the middle for want of a more accurate term, but using a smaller brush now we can pick them out and hopefully just again start showing a little more clearly that there is some depth going on in here. A little bit of our ultramarine blue maybe just splashed in. That's just suggesting, it's not something we can actually see, but it is suggesting the idea of something that we might expect in a waterfall. Little splashes of water, little foamy bits in our vision. And there we go, little touches here and there. Now up here, we'll get a bit more depth. You can see as it dries, watercolour as well as working in layers, one of the pretty much the definitions of watercolour is that it dries paler than you lay it down. So you'll need, as it dries, to just find where's the contrast been lost and come back and add a little bit in. Now, one thing we haven't yet done, which I said we would do, and I do intend to keep my promise, is get some of these greens in. So using a bit of green Apatite Genuine and a little bit of that ultramarine, just going to get some of these lighter green shades in, and we can just bring them down as they fall down in this image. They sort of come across, bring them down, little sort of just gentle touches of green, and then I'll use that same green just in the foreground because we want to balance the colours, not have them just feel like they're in one place. The greens can also go nicely in the water. You know, the water isn't really green, or not in the photo anyway, but having a colour balanced out is really important to me in my style of painting. And there we go. I think we're almost ready to just take a step back and see what happens when we dry, maybe just with a tiny bit more intensity of green in a couple of places. We'll just see what happens when this dries, and we'll consider whether we want to do anything else. More bold colours, a bit more ink, or just leave it as it is, as a nice sort of painterly, semi-abstract waterfall. And here we are, pretty much dry. I think that there is a little room for some more clarity of line. So all I'm going to do is touch in a little bit more of my ink. And I can use this ink just to find those edges and really show the intention behind the top of the cliff, for example. Really embolden it and show that we have this structure looming down, and it becomes a little softer here. But in places we can really see it. So again, in places we can join up these darker bits of colour and just get a little bit clearer on that silhouette. Even around here where we haven't got colour doesn't mean we can't just make our silhouette feel a little clearer. Underneath, well, we can do something similar with the edges. In a few places, apply a nice bold line. So what I'm doing is pressing a bit harder with my fountain pen. If you have a fine liner, then what you might want to do is pick up a bolder fine liner, and that will give you a bolder line, of course. Coming down here, a little bit more clarity to this edge as well, without overdoing it. Don't want to make this too much of an illustrative thing. But at the same time, I personally enjoy celebrating the medium I'm using, and I'm using ink and watercolour, so I want there to be evidence of my ink in there, evidence of sort of inky textures that we've applied. Along the back here, same idea, just a little more clarity to some of these edges. I remember we'd left some of these edges out purposefully because we were leaving them as misty uncertainty, but now we've got the colour, we can start to find a bit more of that certainty with those bolder lines. These rocks as well, we can give them little bits of hatching, little bits of texture. We can find new edges in our watercolour. You might find, for example, you want to just provide a little bit more suggestion of texture in the foreground because the foreground might feel like it needs something extra. So for me, maybe just little scratchy marks to show that there's quite a lot going on here, and to provide the watercolour with some extra certainty in the front. I quite like doing bits of hatching as well, just to build up, again, the idea, you know what, celebrate the fact that we have used ink in our painting. It's not just watercolour. Now, we're almost there, I feel, almost there. Little touches, just again, finding a few of these areas we inked in originally. We can find a few of these dark areas, these dark edges from the watercolour. And you can tell when I stop talking loads. Many of you are probably thinking, oh, finally he's quiet, but you can tell I'm concentrating. But I think with that concentration, I'm happy to call this one done. If you've enjoyed this, please do like and subscribe and hit the notification button so you can be the first to know when I release a new video. So thank you everyone for watching my little sketching videos. If you enjoy my content, please do subscribe to my channel because it makes me really, really happy. Thanks again.